What if I told you that the entire history of American warfare, from the muskets of the Revolution to the drones over the Middle East, could be understood by following the money, not the flags? Forget the battles, the heroes, and the reasons they teach you in school. There is a hidden pattern, a blueprint for profiting from conflict, that has made the exact same families fantastically unimaginably wealthy for over 200 years. This isn't some vague conspiracy theory. This is a business model, one more profitable than striking oil, more reliable than high finance, and more fiercely protected than any government-sanctioned monopoly. It is a story written in public government contracts, in documented corporate profits, and in the blood of millions. For 6 generations, it has built dynasties that now control billions upon billions of dollars in assets, dynasties that have funded political careers, shaped university endowments, and plastered their names on charitable foundations. And it is all built on one simple, brutal principle: profit from war, every war, any war. Because while the soldiers die and the taxpayers foot the bill, a very small, very exclusive group of companies and the families behind them always win. The evidence is not buried. It is in plain sight, and the pattern is absolutely undeniable. Let me introduce you to the architects of this system. The DuPont family, masters of explosives and chemicals, whose profits span from the Revolutionary War all the way through the invasion of Iraq, a staggering 220 years of war-fueled wealth. The Rockefellers, titans of oil and fuel, whose energy monopoly was indefensible from the Civil War through the long conflict in Afghanistan. The modern banking dynasty, the financiers of war itself, who profited by lending to governments on all sides from the Spanish-American War through the Second World War. The predecessors of Lockheed Martin, pioneers of aviation, and advanced weapon-aided defense contracts for over a century, from the biplanes of World War I to the stealth fighters of today. And finally, Halliburton, the experts in military logistics and infrastructure who perfected the art of the no-bid contract and the cost overrun from World War II all the way through the War on Terror. 5 families, 5 corporate empires, and if you dare to track their profits across the timeline of American history, you see the exact same sequence play out with sickening regularity. A war is declared, and their stock prices surge. The contracts are awarded, often without competition, and their profits explode into the stratosphere. The war eventually ends, and they simply keep the money. And when the next war inevitably starts, they are right there, ready and waiting. They did not just profit from war, you see. Through sophisticated lobbying, through massive political donations, and through the subtle shaping of American foreign policy, they helped create the very conditions that made these wars almost inevitable. This is not a hidden plot. This is simply capitalism applied to its most extreme and violent form, organized human conflict. And the receipts, they're all a matter of public record. Allow me to show you precisely how it works, war by war, contract by contract, dollar by dollar. We will begin with the family that quite literally invented the American military-industrial complex. The DuPonts, if you have heard the name DuPont, it is likely in connection with chemicals, or perhaps the Teflon on your frying pan. But the foundation of the immense DuPont fortune was not built on household convenience, it was built on gunpowder. They have been the primary supplier of explosives for every single American war since the year 1802. Let us start with how they brilliantly positioned themselves. Atlether Irtene DuPont, an astute chemist who had honed his skills in the Royal French gunpowder mills, arrived in America from France in the year 1800. He saw a land brimming with opportunity, an America that had just fought a revolution and was now pushing relentlessly westward. This expansion meant a constant, insatiable need for explosives, for clearing land, for mining precious resources, and, most importantly, for war. In 1802, he founded the DuPont Company on the banks of the Brandywine River in Delaware. The location was a stroke of strategic genius close to the political centers of Philadelphia and Washington, with ready access to water power for his mills, yet just far enough from major cities that the inevitable catastrophic edict by the time the War of 1812 erupted, DuPont was already positioned to supply gunpowder to the fledgling United States military. This was their first major government contract, and it established the lucrative pattern that would repeat itself for the next 2 centuries. A war begins. The government desperately needs explosives, and DuPont is ready with existing their production, and they make enormous profits. The war ends, they keep the massively expanded infrastructure, and they patiently wait for the next conflict. During the Mexican-American War from 1846 to 1848, DuPont once again supplied the gunpowder for the Army's artillery and small arms. The contract was worth over $1 million, a sum equivalent to about $35 million in today's money. But the true value was not just the immediate cash. It was in cementing DuPont's status as the government's preferred indispensable supplier. When you were the company that delivered during the last war, you were always the first in line for the next one. The Civil War from 1861 to 1865 was DuPont's absolute breakthrough. The Union Army required gunpowder on a scale previously unimaginable in human history. 4 years of continuous brutal warfare, hundreds of major battles, millions upon millions of rounds fired. The DuPont mills ran 24 hours a day. 7 days a week, they produced over 4 million pounds of gunpowder for the Union cause. The contracts were worth more than $10 million, which is over $300 million in today's currency, and that was just the direct sales. DuPont also sold their product to private contractors, who then sold it to the government at a significant markup. Now here is where the story gets truly interesting. The DuPont family themselves were Northern Democrats. They were politically opposed to the abolition of slavery, and some family members even privately sympathized with the Confederacy, but they sold their gunpowder exclusively to the Union, because that is where the massive government contracts, where ideology was irrelevant. Only profit mattered. And after the war, when the Union had won, DuPont was masterfully rebranded as a patriotic company that had helped to save the nation. The complex and morally ambiguous reality of their actual position was conveniently forgotten, and only the profit remained. World War I, from 1914 to 1918, transformed DuPont from merely a large company into a true dynasty. Even before America officially entered the war in 1917, DuPont was selling millions of pounds of gunpowder, Tennessee tea, and smokeless powder to Britain and France. When America finally joined the Allied forces, DuPont's production increased exponentially. The profits were simply staggering. DuPont's net earnings skyrocketed from $5 million in 1914 to $82 million in 1918. That is over $1 billion today. In just 4 years, they increased their profits by 1,600%. And here is the critical part of the strategy. After the war, they did not return that money or scale down. They used those immense war profits to diversify, branching out into chemicals, plastics, and synthetic materials, building a colossal peacetime empire on a foundation of wartime gains. But they never stopped selling to the military. World War II brought yet another surge in demand. DuPont supplied a Spiro. They operated the plutonium production facility at Hanford, Washington. Their contract was a thing of beauty for a business. It was cost prugo, meaning the government paid for all of their expenses, plus a guaranteed profit on top. They literally could not lose money. The government absorbed every ounce of risk. Korea, Vietnam, the Gulf War, Iraq, Afghanistan. Every single conflict saw DuPont or its successor companies supplying critical materials. By the 2000s, DuPont's dedicated defense division had been spun off and merged into other corporate entities. But the family wealth, the original seed money from gunpowder, remained. The DuPont family trust is now worth an estimated $30 billion, 6 generations removed from Melithariotene, and they are all still living off the profits of gunpowder. Now, let us turn our attention to the Rockefellers and their black gold oil, the one resource that every single modern military needs to function, and the family that monopolized it for a century. John D. Rockefeller founded Standard Oil in 1870. By 1880, he controlled a breathtaking 90% of America's entire oil refining capacity. This was not merely a business, it was a leviathan, a true monopoly. And when America went to war, that monopoly became a priceless treaty asset. The Spanish-American War in 1898 was a small conflict, but it was incredibly significant for the future of warfare. The United States Navy had just transitioned its fleet from coal-powered ships to oil-powered ships in the 1890s. This single technological shift made Standard Oil absolutely essential to national security. Naval vessels needed fuel oil, and Rockefeller was the only one who could provide it on the necessary scale. The war lasted only a few months, but it firmly established oil as a military necessity, and Rockefeller learned a valuable lesson. Control the fuel, and you control the military. World War I was the first truly industrial war, a conflict where oil was the decisive factor. Tanks, trucks, airplanes, and ships all required vast quantities of petroleum products. And Standard Oil, although it had been technically broken up by antitrust action in 1911, still dominated the market through its numerous successor. Kent's, Mobil, Chevron, all were controlled by Rockefeller interests. They supplied fuel to the United States millions. But here is where the Rockefeller strategy diverged from DuPont's. They did not just sell to one side. The German subsidiary of Standard Oil sold fuel to Germany. Even after America entered the war, Rockefeller companies continued to trade with Germany through neutral countries. This was not considered treason. It was just business, and it was perfectly legal, because the companies were technically separate entities. The profits they reaped from both sides of World War I turned the Rockefellers into the wealthiest family in America. John D. Rockefeller became the world's first ever billionaire. The family then diversified into banking, real estate, and philanthropy. But oil always remained the bedrock of their fortune. World War II saw the exact same playbook repeated. Rockefeller companies supplied fuel to the United States military under exclusive cost-sharing contracts that guaranteed massive profits. Standard Oil of New Jersey, the predecessor to Exxon, was even investigated by Congress for trading with Nazi Germany. This gave Germany access to technology that prolonged the war. Senator Harry Truman, before he became president, led the investigation. His committee concluded that Standard Oil's actions had actively damaged the war effort, but no one was ever prosecuted. The company was simply too important. The military needed their fuel too desperately, so the investigation was quietly shelved, and the lucrative contracts continued to flow. Korea, Vietnam, the Gulf War. Every conflict since has required oil, and ExxonMobil and Chevron, the Rockefeller-Sesser companies, have always been there to supply it. The profits became so astronomically large that by the 1970s, the Rockefeller family began to strategically divest from oil, partly to avoid intense political scrutiny. The Rockefeller family fortune is estimated at $11 billion today, a fortune built on oil, sold to armies that burned it while fighting wars. Now we must discuss the Morgan banking dynasty and the art of war financing, because wars do not just run on weapons and fuel, they run on money, and the people who lend that money profit handsomely, regardless of who wins or loses. J.P. Morgan founded his banking empire in the 1870s. By 1900, J.P. Morgan & Company was the most powerful bank in America, perhaps the world, and Morgan understood a fundamental truth that would define a century of conflict. Governments at war will borrow money at any interest rate. They have no other choice. The alternative is defeat. The Spanish-American War in 1898 was financed in part through Morgan loans to the United States government. It was a small war, which meant small loans. But it was crucial for establishing the relationship. The government learned to trust Morgan, and Morgan profited from the interest. World War I was an entirely different beast. When the war broke out in Europe in 1914, America was officially neutral. But American banks, led by J.P. Morgan, began lending enormous sums of money to Britain and France. They lent over $2 billion between 1914 and 1917, a figure equivalent to over $50 billion today. These loans were used to purchase weapons, food, and supplies, much of which came from American companies. So American banks were lending money to the Allies, who then spent that money buying goods from American companies. The money circulated within the American economy, but the profit stuck to the bankers and the industrialists, at both ends of the transaction. Here is the absolutely critical turning point. Those massive loans made continued American neutrality financially. By 1917, Britain and France owed so much money to American banks that their defeat in the war would have triggered a catastrophic financial crisis in the United States. If they lost, they could not possibly repay their debts. American banks would collapse, and the economy would crater. So when President Woodrow Wilson asked Congress to declare war in April of 1917, it was not just about making the world safe for democracy or German aggression. It was about protecting American financial interests. Senator George Norris of Nebraska stated it explicitly during a war declaration debate. He said, "But we are going into war upon the command of gold. We are about to put the dollar sign on the American flag." He bravely voted against the war, but Congress voted for it, and J.P. Morgan's loans were suddenly secured by the full might of America's military power. After the war, Morgan profited yet again. Germany owed crushing reparations to the Allies, and the Allies owed massive war debts to America. Morgan arranged the complex loans that allowed Germany to pay those reparations, which the Allies then used to repay their American loans. Morgan's bank collected fees at every single step of this circular flow of debt. The Dawes Plan in 1924 and the Young Plan in 1929, both structured by Morgan bankers, refinanced billions in war debt, and Morgan collected millions in fees for their services. World War II followed the same script before America entered the war. Morgan banks financed British war purchases. After Pearl Harbor, the United States government borrowed heavily to fund the war effort through war bonds and treasury securities. Morgan banks underwrote them, collecting fees on every single issuance. And after the war, Morgan banks helped to finance the reconstruction of Europe. The Marshall Plan, which rebuilt the continent, was administered partly through Morgan-connected institutions. The Cold War, Korea, Vietnam, every conflict required financing, and Morgan banks, which eventually merged to become J.P. Morgan Chase, were always involved underwriting government debt, financing defense contractors, and profiting immensely from the interest and fees. The Morgan family is no longer involved in the day-to-day operations of the bank, but the wealth endures. The family fortune is estimated at $30 billion, built by lending money for wars and collecting interest, while soldiers died paying the ultimate cost. Let us now examine Lockheed Martin, or, more accurately, the collection of companies that merged to become the behemoth we know today. Military aviation has been an incredibly profitable business ever since World War I. The Lucas brothers, who later spelled their name Lockheed, founded their aircraft company in 1912. By the time World War I began, they were already building planes for the military. These were small contracts for experimental designs, but aviation was clearly the future of warfare, and the companies that got in on the ground floor positioned themselves for a century of profits. World War I saw limited use of aircraft, mostly for reconnaissance with some primitive bombing, but the potential was obvious to everyone after the war. Military aviation contracts dried up, and many aircraft companies went bankrupt. Lockheed survived by building civilian planes, but they shrewdly kept their military connections alive and well. World War II was their monumental breakthrough. Aircraft were the decisive weapon of the war. Bombers, fighters, and transport planes were all essential. Lockheed built the legendary P-38 Lightning Fighter, producing over 10,000 of them. They built the Hudson bomber with over 2,800. But here's where Lockheed's real innovation lay. They did not just build excellent planes, they built relationships with the Pentagon. They hired former high-ranking military officers as executives. They strategically located their factories in congressional districts where influential representatives, and they made themselves politically untouchable. After World War II, the Cold War kept the contracts flowing endlessly. Lockheed built the U-2 spy plane, the SR-71 Blackbird, and the C-130 Hercules cargo plane, which is still in use today. Every decade brought new, more expensive contracts, and Lockheed's strategy was always the same. Build good enough products, deliberately underestimate the initial costs to secure the contract, and then come back to the government for more and more money. Claiming the project is more complex than originally expected. The Pentagon always paid because canceling a multi-billion-dollar project and admitting to such colossal waste was politically impossible. The C-5 Galaxy transport plane is the perfect example of this model in action. The initial contract in 1965 was for $2.1 billion. By the time the planes were delivered, the actual cost had ballooned to $5.3 billion, 150% over budget. Did Lockheed lose money? Of course not. It was a cost crudo contract. They got paid for all of their costs, plus their guaranteed profit. The Pentagon could not cancel the program because they had already spent billions. So they paid. Lockheed profited, and Congress approved it all because the factory empowered thousands of voters in Georgia, a key political state, Vietnam, the Gulf War, Afghanistan, Iraq. Every conflict brought a fresh wave of Lockheed contracts. By the 1990s, the military-industrial complex was consolidating. Lockheed merged with Martin Marietta in 1995 to become the Lockheed Martin of today. They are now the largest defense contractor in the world, with $65 billion in revenue in 2023, 90% of which comes directly from Gulfstream, and the pattern continues unabated. The F-35 fighter jet is the most expensive weapons program in human history. Its original budget was $233 billion. The current estimated cost is over $1.7 trillion. That is, trillion with a T. It is 7 times over budget, and Lockheed is getting paid for every single cent of it. Every cost overrun is covered by the Pentagon because they cannot cancel the program. Too much has been invested, there are too many jobs at stake, and there are far too many congressional districts dependent on the program for their economic survival. The Lockheed family no longer directly controls the company. It is a publicly traded corporation. But the shareholders profit immensely, and the pattern established over a century ago continues without interruption. A war is declared. Lockheed's stock price rises, contracts are awarded, costs inevitably overrun. The government pays, the shareholders profit, and then they repeat the cycle. Finally, we come to Halliburton, the company that transformed militaros. Halliburton was founded in 1919 by Earl P. Halliburton. Initially, it was an oil services company specializing in cementing oil wells, but its founder understood a key principle. Building infrastructure, whether for oil fields or for military bases, was an incredibly lucrative business. By World War II, Halliburton was building bases, airfields, and ports for the military. The pattern was elegantly simple. The military needs infrastructure built incredibly fast. Halliburton has the expertise and the equipment ready to go. They get no-buy contracts because in the heat of war, there is no time for a competitive bidding process. They build the facility under a cost-per contract, which means they get paid for all of their expenses, plus a guaranteed profit. It is impossible for them to lose money. The Korean War saw Halliburton building bases and infrastructure. Vietnam was even bigger. Halliburton, through its subsidiary Brown and Root, built roads, ports, and airfields all across South Vietnam. The contracts were worth billions, and they were awarded without any competitive bidding because Brown and Root had cultivated deep political connections. And here is where the political connection becomes absolutely critical. George Brown, the founder of Brown and Root, was a major political donor to Lyndon B. Johnson. Johnson's entire political career was partly funded by Brown. When Johnson became president, Brown and Root received massive, unprecedented contracts. For Vietnam, political donations lead to access to power, which leads to government contracts, which leads to immense profit. The Gulf War in 1991 brought Halliburton back into the spotlight. Dick Cheney was the Secretary of Defense at the time Halliburton received contracts to build facilities in Saudi Arabia and Kuwait. After the war, Cheney left government and became the Chief Executive Officer of Halliburton in 1995. He ran the company until the year 2000, when he became Vice President under George W. Bush. And then came the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. Halliburton, through its subsidiary KBR, received contracts worth over $40 billion. These were almost all no-bid contracts with cost-per pricing. Halliburton built bases, provided food services, supplied fuel, and managed all logistics. And the costs were astronomical. The Pentagon's own inspector general found billions of dollars in waste and fraudulent billed the government for meals that were never served, for fuel deliveries that never happened, and for construction that was never completed. When questioned, Halliburton's executives argued that war zones are chaotic environments and that some waste is simply inevitable. The government agreed and kept paying the bills. Dick Cheney, as vice president, officially recused himself from any contract decisions involving his former company. But Halliburton received more government contracts during his tenure than in any previous period in its history, from 2003 to 2008. Halliburton's government contracts increased by 400%, their stock price tripled, and when Cheney left office in 2009, he still held Halliburton stock options worth millions of dollars. This is the complete pattern. A company hires powerful politicians as executives. When wars start, those relationships are converted into lucrative contracts, and the profit is shared. The politicians retire wealthy, the companies get richer, and the taxpayers pay for all of it. Now, let me show you the overarching pattern, the blueprint that connects all 5 of these stories, because it is not just that these families profited from war, it is how they profited, using the exact same strategy repeated for 150 years. Step 1. Position yourself before the war. All 5 of these companies established themselves as essential to national security long before any conflict began. DuPont built up its explosive manufacturing to padding. Morgan cultivated deep banking-realized oil refining. Lockheed maintained its military contracts even between wars. Halliburton built up its infrastructures. When war started, they were ready, and their competitors were not. Step 2. Get the first contract. The government needs supplies immediately. There is no time for competitive bidding. The companies that are already positioned get the no-bid contracts. The justification is always national security, a claim that we cannot wait for bids because we need it now. And once you have that first contract, the next ones are infinitely easier to get. You are now the proven trusted supplier. Step 3. Insist on cost-proking pricing. Almost every major war contract from the Civil War onwards has been structured as cost proto. The contractor bills the government for all of its costs plus a guaranteed percentage for the company. If costs overrun, the government pays. If the project takes longer than expected, the contractor actually makes more profit. The financial incentive is to maximize costs, not to minimize them. Step 4. Overrun the budget. Every single major weapon system in the last 50 years has come in wildly over budget. The F-35 is 7 times over the Zermatt destroyer, 3 times over the littoral combat ship, double. This is not incompetence. It is the business model. You underbid to get the contract and then you continuously revise the cost estimates upward. The government cannot cancel the project because they have already invested billions of taxpayers. Step 5. Hire the regulators. When high-ranking military officers retire, where do they go? They go to work for defense contractors. The generals who approved Lockheed contracts become Lockheed executives. The admirals who oversaw shipbuilding join the boards of shipbuilding companies. This revolving door between the Pentagon. Step 6. Lobby for more war. This is the darkest part of the entire scheme. Defense contractors spend millions of dollars lobbying Congress every single year. They donate lavishly to political campaigns. They fund influential think tanks that produce academic liquidation. The Center for Strategic and International Studies, the American Enterprise Institute both have received substantial funding from DEDIC. When the invasion of Iraq was being debated in 2002, defense contractors funded organizations that produced intelligence reports supporting the invasion. They paid for television advertisements, and they hired retired generals to appear on news shows advocating for war. And when the war was approved, those very same contractors received billions of dollars in contracts. Did they single-handedly create the Iraq War? Number. But they fostered an environment where war was seen as a more likely and acceptable solution, and they profited immensely when it happened. Step 7. Diversify the profit. The profits from war do not just stay in the weapons business. DuPont used its explosives profits to build a chemical empire. Rockefeller used his oil profits to buy banks and real estate. Morgan used the profits from war lending to finance peacetime industries. The companies diversify so that even when the wars eventually end, the wealth remains, and the families behind these companies become untouchable dynasties. Their multi-generational wealth built on a foundation of conflict. Let me now show you the sheer scale of this operation. How much profit are we actually talking about? DuPont's total revenue from military contracts since 1802 is estimated at over $50 billion in inflation-adjusted currency. Rockefeller companies have earned over $100 billion in fuel sales to the military since 1898. Morgan banks have collected interest and fees from war financing estimated at over $75 billion. Lockheed Martin and its predecessors have taken in over $200 billion for their aircraft and systems since 1917. And Halliburton has made over $60 billion in logistics and infrastructure since 1942. In total, these 5 companies and their predecessors have extracted $485 billion from American taxpayers through war contracts alone. It does not even include the indirect profits, the stock price increases, the real estate bought with war profits, or the other industries that were built using war capital. If you were to include all of that, the number is well over $1 trillion. And here's the most critical detail of all. That money came directly from taxpayers. Every single dollar paid to DuPont for explosives was taken from American workers through taxes. Every dollar paid to Halliburton for logistics came from deficit spending that future generations will have to repay. These are not normal business profits. This is a massive transfer of public funds into private hands, all justified by the specter of war. Is this still happening? Yes, it is happening right now. Let me show you the current numbers. In 2023, the United States military budget was $816 billion. The five largest defense contractors, Lockheed Martin, Boeing, Raytheon, General Dynamics, and Northrop Grumman, received over $200 billion in contracts. That is 25% of the entire defense budget, going to just 5 companies. And the pattern continues. These companies employed former Pentagon officials. They lobby Congress relentlessly. The F-35 program built by Lockheed has suppliers in 45 states. That is entirely intentional. It means that 90 senators have constituents who are employed by the program. Voting against the F-35 means voting against jobs in your home state. So Congress keeps funding it, even though it is 7 times over budget, even though it is years behind schedule, and even though it has over 800 documented defects. The pattern established by DuPont in 1802 continues to this day. War is profitable for the companies, for their shareholders, for their executives, and for the politicians who receive their donations and get lucrative jobs after they retire. The only people who do not profit are the soldiers who do the fighting, and the taxpayers who do the paying now. Let me show you something that should make you truly angry: the opportunity cost. What could America have built with that $485 billion if it had not gone to war profits? $485 billion could fund free college tuition for every American student for 20 years. It could build a high-speed rail network connecting every major city in the country. It could fund universal health care for a decade. It could fund cancer research for a century. But instead, it bought explosives, fuel, weapons, and logistics for wars, some of which were necessary, but many which were not. And the companies profited while the public good suffered. This is not about debating whether specific wars were justified. Some were. World War II was necessary. But even necessary wars were shamelessly exploited for private profit. And many other wars were encouraged, prolonged, or escalated precisely because it was profitable. The Vietnam War could have ended years earlier, but defense contractors lobbied to continue it. The Iraq War was sold on false intelligence, some of which was produced by contractor-funded think tanks. Afghanistan became a 20-year occupation, partly because contractors were making billions of dollars rebuilding what our military had just destroyed. The profit motive did not create these wars out of thin air, but it made them longer, bloodier, and far more expensive than they ever needed to be. And here is the final infuriating piece of the puzzle. The families are untouchable. Despite mountains of evidence of overcharging, of fraud, and of blatant profiteering, no one ever goes to jail. DuPont was investigated for its explosive monopoly practices in the 1930s, and nothing happened. Standard Oil was broken up for being a monopoly, but the Rockefellers kept their immense wealth. Morgan banks were investigated for war profiteering after World War I, and there were no prosecutions. Halliburton was investigated for overcharging in Iraq. They paid a small fine, kept their contracts, and continued profiting. Lockheed was investigated for bribing foreign officials to buy their weapons. They paid a fine, and the executives faced no jail time. The pattern is consistent. Investigations find wrongdoing. Fines are paid, but the fines are always just a tiny fraction of the profits. No individuals are ever prosecuted. The companies continue operating, and the pattern continues because these companies are too important to prosecute. The military depends on them. Congress depends on them for jobs in their districts. The economy depends on them, so they are protected even when they break the law. 5 families, 5 companies, 150 years of every major American war, and the pattern is identical every single time. Position before the war, get the contracts, overrun the costs, hire the regulators, lobby for more, and profit while others die. This is not a conspiracy, this is documented history. The contracts are public, the profits are recorded, the pattern is undeniable, and it is still happening right now. The only question is whether anyone will ever stop it. History suggests they will not, because the companies are too powerful, the politicians are too dependent, and the public is too distracted to care. If this has changed how you see military spending, if you finally understand that for some, war is not a tragedy but a business model, then you are starting to see the pattern. 5 families, billions in profit, built on wars that killed millions. If you want to understand how power actually works in this world, subscribe to this channel, because they are not going to teach you this in school. They are going to teach you that these companies are patriotic, that they serve the nation, and that war profiteering is just a conspiracy theory. But the contracts are a matter of public record. And the pattern has repeated for 150 years, 5 families, every war. The same result. They profit, we pay, and soldiers die. Thank you for watching.